Julian sometimes gets a little bit of flack for not being biblical, and especially when people read the parable of the Lord and servant. Um, it's like, well, that's a really cool idea, but isn't she just kind of, she had some vision and she's sharing it. I mean, are we really going to take that authoritatively in the same way that we take, the parables of Jesus? Jesus, I know, but Julian, who's that? That's a legitimate concern. We don't just, I'm not just throwing out stuff and being like, take this as gospel. Really, it does need to be squared with Scripture. I just want to motivate for a moment the notion that Julian is not unfamiliar with Scripture. And so I'm just going to do a little bit of what little we know of her biography, and then a little bit about her use of the text of Scripture. First, we don't know much of anything about Julian at all. We know that she was probably active around the turn of the 15th century, so around 1400-ish was when she was writing. And Anchorus, she's known as Julian the Anchorus, or Julian of Norwich. Anchorus is somebody who, either because of being widowed or just out of a choice, devotes their life to mostly solitary contemplative prayer. Not necessarily, you can be a lay person and do this, a lay woman and do this. You don't necessarily need to be a member of a convent, although some people think that Julian was a nun. Some speculate that maybe there was a time of great plagues in England around the time that she's active. Perhaps she's widowed by these plagues and then retreats to the cloister as a response. We don't really know. She does appear to be able to write in Middle English. There's a question about her ability to read Latin. This is a big issue because most of the texts of Scripture at the time would have been Latin translations. They would have been some version of the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation, more or less Jerome's translation of the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible, so into Latin. So depending on whether or not she speaks, reads, and writes Latin, that impinges quite a bit on her ability to read and know texts. It's not the only way she would have known the Bible. There's other ways as well, like she may have been familiar with English translations, or she might have been familiar with, maybe having memorized prayers, because prayers typically incorporate the language of Scripture. There's a lot of different ways in that culture where one would be soaked in the language and the rhythms and certainly the theological themes of Scripture. The last major, there's been some work on her familiarity with the Bible, and there's no 100% consensus. The only thing that everyone agrees on is that Julian she is extremely biblical. Now, whether that means that she read Latin and studied the Vulgate in the cloister, or it means that she wasn't a Latinate, didn't know Latin, but at the same time was still just saturated with Middle English translations. One way or the other, she was very, very biblical, and we know that because of a number of different phrases that she uses, the themes that she uncovers. There's some really interesting connections. I mean, in the parable of the Lord and the servant, there appears to be a quote from Psalm 58, which is interesting because Psalm 58 is it's a telling of in the Vulgate. It's put in David's mouth. I think even if you look in the New King James, sort of the introductory text will say, the Psalm of David when he was being pursued by Paul, or when Saul's soldiers were waiting in ambush. And this is a reference to, I think, 1 Samuel 19, where David is being pursued by Saul, and he holes up in this house, and he's afraid to leave because he's going to get ambushed. And this is the moment where the Vulgate introductory text says that Psalm 58 comes. And Psalm 58 is all about being, I'm surrounded by my enemies, God. It's not my fault. I'm a good guy. You know I've served you, Lord. You know that I've been following you, Lord. I desperately seek your goodness, and yet all these bad things are about to happen. And there's even an interesting part where the Vulgate translates a verb, yisarun in the Hebrew. The Vulgate's translating the Greek, and so the Greek translation of the Old Testament Septuagint, and says I ran rather than they ran. It can go either way. It doesn't matter. The point is that if you're reading Psalm 58 and you're thinking about David being a good guy, a good sinless, or more or less sinless, like upright, righteous man, like beset by enemies, and then you realize that's being quoted in the parable of the Lord and servant, which, I mean, could there be a better description of what's going on with the servant in Julian's parable? She's reading the human condition through Psalm 58, through David's experience as being an upright person who wants to serve the Lord and yet is beset, ambushed, trapped, falling, as it were, and being attacked. Similarly, she sees humanity as doing something similar. Humanity wasn't looking for an opportunity to be separated from God, but it happened. So I want to suggest that if you jump into Scripture and you don't just read humanity's condition as Genesis 2 and 3 and that's it, but if you get a bigger view of how the Bible thinks about humanity's condition, it's not inconceivable that you're going to come up with something like Julian's, which is to say that Julian is not simply adding on to Scripture and she's just creating theology. No, she's really deeply interactive with the texts. That might be harder for us to see if we're not, reading her in Latin or whatever. But I assure you, it's true. She's deeply soaked in the rhythms and the themes and even the language of the texts. And there are other examples, but that's one. So she is being biblical, but biblical not necessarily in the way that we're used to thinking about it, maybe. And that's another point, last point on this. And this is about the nature of the text. It's a parable. Which, incidentally, I mean that's definitely something that she gets from the Bible, right? Julian has a vision, yes, but notice that the vision is structured according to a very biblical grammar, as it were, right? It's not coincidence that Julian writes a parable, and when she does that, when she's writing a parable, notice that the way Jesus tells parables is very similar to the way that she tells them, where Jesus isn't. He's not giving us a point by point, recitation of some part of the Old Testament, although his parables do invoke large themes of the Old Testament. And so a lot of times in the parables, it'll appear as though Jesus is taking a shot, say, at the religious leaders, which is something that the prophets did in the latter part of the Old Testament. But it's not like Jesus is just giving us a parable that translates Micah 6, Like he's not just taking one of the prophet's paragraphs and being like, duh, duh, duh. Instead, in some ways, he's telescoping, or he's compressing, or he's giving the broad outlines of what you get of prophetic themes with respect to corrupt religious leaders and corrupt political leaders. And that's what he does in his parables. Well, similarly, I think Julian is doing something with humanity. Yeah, she uses the term Adam, but she's not retelling Genesis 2 to 3. She's telling something much more cosmic, much larger than Genesis 2 to 3, which is obvious when you remember that she brings Jesus in. Jesus isn't there in Genesis 2 to 3. When she uses things like the gardener and the furious digging, and she even brings in the incarnation as part of the story, Julian is not giving us a point-by-point retelling of Adam and Eve being tempted and picking the fruit and eating it. That's not what she's doing. She's saying if you step back and you get the Bible as a whole, and you read the Scriptures as a whole, and you let them mutually interpret, might you not come up with something like this? And that's how she's doing theology. It's this is humanity's plight, start to finish. And when we look at it that way, having the whole Scriptures, having the tradition of the church, might it not be that something like this is what we might say God is up to, right? Might we not characterize the incarnation in this way, as this kind of good? Might we not reconfigure our notion of what sin is to make it so that it can address something like this? Which is all to say that it's definitely biblical. And it's also, possibly very orthodox. She's not just doing theology out of whole cloth. She's really deeply dependent on the texts and the rhythms and the theological themes of Scripture.